Hello, my name's Claire Madge and I'm a lecturer in the Department of Geography at the University of Leicester. Last week we talked about asynchronous online interviewing. This week I want to move on to consider synchronous online interviewing. Basically, synchronous online interviewing is real-time interviewing, so you are posting your questions and the respondents are answering your questions more or less at the same time. So you are both online at the same time, so there is synchronicity in your response. So this type of interview most closely resembles the sort of face-to-face interviewing scenario that you might get with more traditional interviewing. There are several advantages in using synchronous online interviewing, and I want to mention three of these now. Firstly, compared to asynchronous interviews, synchronous interviews obviously provide much greater spontaneity and much greater levels of interaction. A second issue, which is sometimes seen as an advantage, is the issue of engagement in a synchronous online interview. Because especially if you're conducting an anonymous online interview, there are no visual clues as to the interviewer or the different interviewees. It's sometimes said that people will tend to be far more open and pertinent in their responses than they might be if they can actually see the interviewer or the other respondents. So, for example, there are no markers of identity or visible markers of identity in terms of gender, age, ethnicity, and some people have argued that this tends to equalise research relationships, although perhaps this is a little bit idealistic because obviously we bring all those identification processes to the online interview. A third issue is that in the synchronous online interview, rather than the most vocal or dominant personality making the greatest contribution, it tends to be the person that has the greatest speed of typing, and so this has an interesting potential to disrupt perhaps power relations that you would have in a face-to-face situation. However, having said that, obviously this changes the rules of engagement, so those people who are not so quick at typing may be disadvantaged, and again this may have implications for your research. For example, perhaps more elderly people or those who don't have such good typing speed. So this has an interesting potential of changing interview interactions, but it's one that you need to think through the implications. So there are some potential advantages of synchronous online interviews, but there are also some disadvantages compared to asynchronous interviewing. And I'm going to mention 5 issues here. The first is that the technology to set up the online synchronous interviewing can be more complex than, for example, using a basic asynchronous email interview, and so the researcher has to select the most appropriate software package, has to ensure that the respondents will know how to use such packages. To date, synchronous interviews have tended to employ conferencing software. However, there have been some more interesting moves recently to use good technologies and some explorations of using Facebook as an interview site. So there are some interesting new Web 2 technologies that you could think of as using as a site for synchronous interviews. A second issue that has been raised is the issue of building rapport in the virtual environment, and this is an issue that you will have to consider. How are you going to build rapport with your interviewees, particularly if you can't see them and they can't see you? One method that I have used is by posting a picture of myself and giving details of myself on a website so the interviewees can visit that site prior to the interview. But also I've used more traditional methods in terms of phoning and emailing, so I build up a rapport prior to actually conducting the interviews. A third issue to consider is that when you're conducting a synchronous online interview, you may not be aware of the distractions that the interviewee is being faced with. You can't see them online, you can't see their situation at home or in the cyber cafe, so you don't know if a child has come in to ask for a drink or if somebody's asked them to borrow a pen in a cyber cafe. So there's no way of you determining their level of concentration on your interview. This is very different to a face-to-face interview where you can quite easily determine whether your interviewee is distracted or not. A fourth issue is that of language. Many online communities and online individuals have developed their own specific online language, so they may use paralinguist expressions or emoticons to replace those kind of visual expressions that you would have when you meet somebody face to face. So if you are conducting your interviews with these specific online communities, it is well worth making sure that you understand these paralinguistic clues that people may be giving you. And this is particularly important when you're analysing your interview transcript. A final issue that is important to consider is that of identity verification. You will need to consider how you can verify the identity of your respondents, whether it is important for you to do so, and if you cannot verify the identity, to build this into your research design and any limitations of your research. So, to finish off then, we've talked over the last 2 weeks about asynchronous interviews and synchronous interviews. To finish off, I just want to raise 11 key issues that you could use as a checklist prior to conducting online interviewing. Firstly, you need to consider why you're using online interviews in the first place. Why are online interviews more appropriate than using face-to-face interviews? What data can you gain from them that you couldn't through face-to-face interviewing? What can be gained and what might be lost through using the online interview? Secondly, are you going to conduct a synchronous interview or an asynchronous interview? The choice will very much depend on the aims of your research. Thirdly, do you want to conduct group interviews or one-to-one interviews? This again will focus down your choice of your specific interview type. Fourthly, you need to consider what type of technology you will use. And fifthly, any type of particular software that you'll need. How will this be installed? How will participants get access to this software if needed? A sixth issue is to consider the technical ability of both yourself but also of the subjects. Don't assume everybody has access to a computer or the same sort of access to a computer that you have. Think about the construction of your interview before you conduct it. As with a face-to-face interview, you need to have a clearly defined interview schedule which clearly relates to the aims of your research. In terms of conducting virtual rapport, this is an important issue. How are you going to create virtual rapport into your interviews? Another issue to consider is how will you deal with non-verbal clues? If people go silent, how will you understand what is not being said as much as what is being said? What are you going to do about technical hitches, if you have them or your interviewees have them? How are you going to overcome these problems? And lastly again, what about the myriad of ethical issues that are involved in conducting online interviews? Okay, thank you very much and good luck with the rest of your course.